I'd like to now take the privilege of introducing Judy Brown, our guest speaker, who not only, as I said before, is listed as one of the 50 young Jewish people who is changing the world, the Jewish world today, but to let you know that she also has a master's degree from Bar-Ilan University in creative writing, and I'm sure those of you who have read the book will find her creative writing to be really very, very good and exceptional, that she can bring us a very important message today, and I'd like to introduce you to Judy Brown.
I was 9 years old when I found a book on a desk in my friend's house. I settled down with it on my staircase to read. I will start again, I'm sorry. Is this how loud it's supposed to be? I was 9 years old when I found a book on a desk in my friend's house. I settled down with it on the staircase to read. I don't remember the title or what the book was about, only how my friend's mother coming up the stairs noticed it. She grabbed the book out of my hands and scolded me. She warned me never to take books without permission. There were books I was not to read. Holding the book firmly in her hand, she closed the door of her room behind her, and the book disappeared, hidden away, I suppose, in that mysterious, forbidden place where all books went that were not to be read. It remains a vivid memory in my mind, the first of many such incidences, be it books, magazines, or pictures, that portray the lifelong hashkafa that was instilled in us in school and at home, that defines the ultra-Orthodox community. More important than what you are allowed to know is what you are not allowed to know. In the ultra-Orthodox world, as we know, words are important, which you can use and which you cannot. Words are powerful. They give life to an image, reality to an idea. If you used bad words, we were told, your mind would be tainted. If you use only good words, your mind was pure. If you used bad words, now somehow you were less than good. Books were therefore precarious. They were filled with words of the outside world. The public library was forbidden. The books in our school library was well censored. They might contain words, vocabulary terms that of course have nothing to do with us. Sexual abuse was not a word. If there was no such word, then there were no such children. And truly, by miracle, somehow for decades, there were none. Nobody was allowed to see them. They did not really dare exist. When I was 9 years old, at the same time, I first heard a story. The story was about a crazy lady. The crazy lady had called the police. The crazy lady had made up stories to them about an uncle and the family. She made up stories because she hated him and wanted attention. When I was 11, a boy from Babiv, a family I knew, hung himself. He wasn't crazy. The reason he hung himself, we were told, was because he didn't have any friends in school. When I was in high school, 14-year-old Chani Deblinger was expelled from school. She had testified to the police that her father had molested her after he demanded custody. I remember my mechaneches explaining to me that it wasn't that Chani was lying. They knew in school that what she was saying was true. But her grandparents raising her had not listened to the Rabbanim. They went to the police. They therefore had no choice. Classmates were warned not to speak with her, and we never saw her again. In the Orthodox world I grew up in, there were two worlds, the outer world and the underworld, and in between them, a horrifying disconnect. The underworld was a dark place. It was filled with silent children, dying, wounded, some rocking madly to a slow death. I was dragged into this world by a close friend. She clung on to me because there was no one else to cling on to. Slowly, like so many other children, we learned to survive. In the years that followed, my life organized itself into parts and pieces, neatly divided places. The day, the night, theory, reality, the outer world and the underworld. One never touched the other. We of the underworld were untouchable. If anyone knew, if it was revealed that we were in any way even associated with abuse, it would defile our entire surroundings. It would destroy our families, their prospects at marriage, of course, their reputation. We were contaminated, and it was our job to protect the community from our contamination. It was our job as children to protect the community from their crimes. At all costs, we must hide. I was 20 years old when I began to write. I wrote mainly for Jewish publications, stories, interviews, news, mostly stories. And the emails quickly began. Through emails, phone calls, chance encounters. Every person with their own story, the one they wanted me to tell. And if I would only write about it, then finally people would understand. The issues were varied. Drugs, depression, gambling. There were emails I answered, phone calls I took, and those I completely ignored. Those I immediately deleted, the piece I had willed myself to forget. There were emails from the other children, children of the underworld. They told me things that happened in school, at home, in camp, things I no longer wanted to hear. I could not stand being tainted. I desperately wanted to just leave that place behind. And besides, I could not write a story for which I had no words. Only when I was 23 years old, living in Israel, in a long conversation with a therapist, did the realization first hit me. Did he finally make clear between what I had witnessed and the words that define it? Abuse, rape, molestation. It was a brutal shock. The space between the two worlds, so safe and far apart, crashed. I watched the walls collide, the underworld erupting through the fragile surface of the outer world. And suddenly, my life looked like a very different place. I found myself processing over and over again in my mind scenes I had seen, stories I had heard, and suddenly it all sounded so different. A short while later, I met a young woman in an exercise class in Israel. We spoke, and she quickly realized I was the writer. She held my hand earnestly. She said, "Wow, this must be Bashert. I love the way you write like a child." And she began to tell me her story. Her brother, 2 years older than her, had recently died of a drug overdose. It was a story that began when they were children. When her brother in 5th grade went from a happy child to a silent one, when his grades slipped, when he stopped sleeping at night, when his parents had no idea what had suddenly gone so wrong. We had a hole between our bedrooms, she explained to me. We would peer through it, giggling and laughing after we were supposed to be sleeping. But that was long before. My brother had stopped doing that. I knew something was terribly wrong with him. He would sit on his bed at night and rock himself, or daydream. One night, I looked through the hole and saw him sitting on his knees, his lips moving, davening. He did this for hours, or at least it seemed like it. I looked 3 times, and my brother was still in the same position on the floor. Finally, I snuck into his room. I said, "Maishi, was tisti? What are you doing? If mommy sees you, she'll punish you." Maishi never looked up. His lips moved. He swayed. Finally, he told me, "I'm saying Tehillim the whole night. My Rebbe says that children's prayers are powerful. They're pure. Hashem listens to them. If I daven for Mashiach the whole night through, by morning he must come, and I won't have to go to school to my Rebbe." Then he went back to davening. I had never seen him pray with so much kavanah. I looked at him for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I felt inside that it was urgent, that it was very important that I sit down near him and say Tehillim with him, though I didn't know why. I got down on my knees. I repeated the psukim I knew by heart again and again until I fell asleep. The woman continued, When I woke up the next morning, I was lying on the floor of my brother's room. I awoke from my mother's screams. She was screaming for Hatala. I ran to the door and saw her holding my brother slumped on the floor, his face white as a ghost. I heard the sirens coming down the block. Mashiach had not come by morning. My brother had swallowed a cup of bleach. In the ER, they said it was an accident. He had confused it with milk. He was in the hospital for days, and he didn't have to go to school. The woman told me that it took years until she realized what had happened. Years of deterioration, streets, drugs, until her brother once mumbled unclearly to her about his Rebbe abuse in school for almost a year. A few months later, he was found dead, heroin strewn on the floor. And now she wanted me to write about it, to write about things that went on and what it did to entire families. I remember stumbling, trying to explain that swirling feeling of desperate helplessness, of wanting to just run away as far as I could. I told her that it was not up to me. Such stories would never be published. I wasn't the right one. And she saw the fear in my eyes. She looked at me, she pointed. She said, "So you're just another kind of murderer, like the rest of them." I don't remember her name. She walked away from me. She went down the escalator. I stayed behind, falling deep into the underworld again. I began to write Hush. It was to be therapeutic. By the last page, the final sentence, I was to be healed, as calm and as at peace as a meditating Buddhist monk. Except I was still living in a deaf world. I was writing words that were banned, forbidden. Here, writing wasn't a gift. It was betrayal. I violated the rules of what is not allowed to be known. And what began as healing quickly turned into a nightmare. The price I paid was dearly high, but there was something almost out of my control that pushed me. I couldn't stop myself by then. I had this terrible need to make them see what I had seen, to rip open this disconnect. Writing essentially is communicating, and where communication was so brutally suppressed, it became a trauma of its own. I needed to find a place from where I could speak, and they would be forced to hear me. I needed to find a place from where I could talk, and even with closed ears, they would be forced to listen. I needed to drag them with me into the underworld, to force them to see the agony. This is how Hush came to be. People ask me if I'm proud of the book. I find that question strange. It is like asking a burn survivor if he is proud of his twisted skin tissue, of his first-degree scars. The book will never be an achievement. It was just a very loud scream. I did not write this book out of courage. I wrote it out of fear, because the only thing that scared me more than publishing was not publishing. There are things you do not forget. There are nightmares that never go away. Recently, I spoke to a victim, a girl who at 13, realizing her friend was trying to kill herself, found a psychologist and secretly began taking her friend every week. The parents never knew. She did this for 2 years. When the psychologist had an issue to discuss, she called up the 13-year-old. It takes a community to raise a child, and it takes a community to destroy one. The deepest scars victims share is often not from the crime itself, but the reaction to it. The years of living in terror and silence, because they were their lepers. The years of standing alone, terrified, against an entire system that taught that they are not supposed to exist, that the scars they carry was a crime they had done somehow. Children absorb. One of the most unforgivable parts of this mental torture is the guilt that consumes a child's mind as he tries to hide his scars. As another victim explained to me, until I was in my late 20s, I was convinced Hashem was putting me in the deepest place in hell. It was a fact of my existence that I was evil, I was damaged. Hashem would punish me for it. As a writer and an adult, this was something I had to fight all the time. The most frustrating aspect of speaking to various people in the community about this was that though I stood in front of them, they could not see me. There were too many other things to see first. It was as if we stood in a large room and there were curtains and curtains between us. A curtain of ideology, of shidduchim, of culture, of Itzachel Hashem. And I stood behind it, trying to be heard. And so it became more than that. I looked at people I knew and respected, people who were often passionate and involved, who watched children die and screamed, Itzachel Hashem. And I found myself grasping at the question that I don't know if I'll ever be able to answer. How? How did this happen? How does a community of values, of God, of family, enable the suffering of so many children? We are, in so many ways, a warm and vibrant world. Giving is fundamental. In Bikur Cholim, Hatzalah, Bonei Olam, Tomchei Shabbos, countless chesed organizations dedicated to easing other suffering. So what happened? In a place where family and children are valued above all, where does this deliberate denial come from when facing abuse? I don't pretend to have the answer. There are many complicated factors that brought us here. Yet, if we look deep within our own mindsets, if we explore the elements that define us, perhaps it is easier to understand. Bikur Cholim, Tomchei Shabbos, and the tens of other organizations, they all deal with tragedies and sufferings that come from above and have long held a place of importance in the Jewish mind. Illness, poverty, widows, orphans. These are mitzvos written about in the Torah, ancient values espoused for thousands of years. They are also, importantly, elements we believe is not in our control, a decree from the heaven. Sexual abuse is not. The concept was like an alien intruder, and we did not have a framework from within which to define it. And perhaps there is another explanation, and that is the Holocaust. By 1945, most of Frum Jewry had been decimated. There were only survivors, a small, traumatized group whose purpose it was to bring the past back to life. They did an heroic job building life on ashes, raising a new generation, children of survivors, brought up in the shadow of a world that was gone. Those children were raised to revere the martyrs of the past, the purity, to give life to those who had died in the unfathomable tragedy. And as they were truly victims of the most tragic kinds, in our minds, they could only have been perfect. Our past was destroyed along with any real sense of it. The goal of the post-Holocaust generation became to recreate this perfect world that once was, and these were the rules. In this narrative, sexual abuse did not fit. There is only one problem. The past never looked like that. There had always been abuse, there had always been alcoholics. For as long as we were humans trapped between angels and beasts, morality has been a struggle, and there have been problems that needed to be dealt with. Yet in the deaths of millions of innocents, in the fragments left in our hands, the problems were not the parts of the stories and legends that we passed on to our children. The point is that the Orthodox community formed a very definite image of themselves. We are chosen, we are persecuted. We are victims, martyrs. It is outsiders hurting insiders. Sexual abuse does not fit. Sexual abuse meant that there were wounds inflicted by other Jews inside the community. If there were scars, then there were criminals. If there were victims, it meant there were villains. We did not want to know our criminals. We chose to hide our scars, to fight like hell those who tried to show it. Then we could continue to feel pure, to be secured by our own delusions that ensured that even if it was there, we never had to see it. By the time my generation grew up, the community had tripled and more. Problems, once easily hidden, burst out from where we had stuffed it under the rug. It was deeply disturbing seeing those scars, the parts of ourselves that didn't fit the narrative. It was terrifying to look in the mirror to see a part of our reflection that is only supposed to belong to the Goyim. The instinctive reaction was denial. This cannot be us. The instinctive reaction turned into community policy, and it was visceral, terrifying, and cruel. It was better to be crazy than to be abused. Crazy was the child's fault. Abused was also theirs. It is of utmost importance to understand that victims process this more than anyone. This cannot be my community. It was easier for us to think it was our fault than to believe that Jews could do such things. Ignorance breeds denial, which breeds ignorance and more denial. As long as we did not allow such words to be spoken and understood, we felt safe, secure from the harm of suffering children. And this is how so much of the firm world turned into a community that went to war with our own children, who chose to use its formidable resources, often so inspiring, to fight 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 16-year-olds who felt better about themselves by invalidating the agony of their most vulnerable, those with no words to describe the hell they were enduring. When I first showed my manuscript, the original one, to an involved Askin, he asked me, "So which suicide did you base it on? Because there were quite a few of those." And then proceeded to convince me not to publish it, because it's a Chilul Hashem. It's a Chilul Hashem. How many times have we heard that term? But the concept of Chilul Hashem, so what is it really? Curiously, when Hashem commanded we not violate his name, he was not talking about your name. Chilul Hashem is a violation of God's reputation, not Mr. Finkelstein's. Chilul Hashem means to do the right thing so as not to desecrate heaven's name, not Reb whoever, not yeshivas whatever, and not the shidduchim of the family down the block. That does not matter at all. God's name is what matters. And how many lives have we destroyed confusing our own complacent arrogance with basic morals? For victims of abuse, it was a place where culture turned into religion, and religion into merely culture. Nobody sensed this more than victims of abuse. It is why, according to reliable statistics, over 70% of those that leave the community have been molested or sexually abused. The chasm between theory and reality is just too big. The gaping disconnect between the good they learned and the fear they lived in tore a hole in their lives too wide to ever close. When a child's been abused at night, he is not processing Mishnayos during the day. Everything takes on the hue of the grotesque. And the 8-year-old or 12-year-old, without words, without tools, without knowledge of his own body, cannot process that. It shatters the mind. It tears the psyche, piece by piece. One victim told me how a Rav, I sat with him for hours trying to convince him, if you just do more mitzvos, if you only keep Shabbos better and focus on your own inner kedusha, it will give you peace of mind and you will be able to forgive and forget. And this to a young man who tried to drown himself. In his own sobbing words, kedusha, Shabbos, are you freaking insane? Torah is not a button you press, a potion you drink with Kiddush wine. It's a tool to help develop our potential. And when we turn it into a slogan, when God becomes a hat, we develop a dangerous complacency to our frailties, and our morals get lost in between. Perhaps you cannot understand what sexual abuse is, but you can understand the consequences. You can understand the point of the spear when it becomes a relief to tie a rope around your neck, to swallow a cup of bleach, to jump off a 7th floor balcony. And for those who lived, who moved on, they mostly left our world for a different one and have never looked back since. You cannot survive your sanity intact at the scene of crime. You cannot heal where there isn't even acknowledgement that what has happened has happened. No, I have not come here only to accuse. What ripped into me when I wrote was that I wrote about a world I loved. I wrote about a world I believed in. Yes, things have changed. There is more awareness, more receptive ears. Very slowly and very painfully, there has been change, in some places a whole lot more than others. Yet for those of my generation, it is something we will carry for the rest of our lives. It says in the Torah that there are 4 steps to doing tshuva: leaving the sin, charata, vidui, and acceptance for the future. If the sin involves Adam l'chavero, one must ask for forgiveness. How do you ask forgiveness from the dead? But one thing is certain, none of these steps are possible without acknowledgement. To change the future, we must really understand the past. We must confront our frailties. We must stop being so enamored with ourselves. For too many years, the Orthodox world was like a cancer patient from whom the word cancer is forbidden, who refuses to learn what cancer is, that it is, and what the options are to cure it. Such a patient will die. Only once there is acknowledgement can comprehensive treatment begin. Only once we fully acknowledge the past can we change ingrained behaviors. Can we really reset our priorities? And that is that most importantly, a person's life comes before shidduchim, the neighbors, and what the goyim will say. To change the future, we need to learn the words, the actual vocabulary words. It had always amazed me how it is that we teach our children the smallest detail of halacha, how to spot a bug in a vegetable, every detail of family purity, kashrus, hilchos Shabbos, yichud, but this, not. How is it that we teach the details of tznius to cover the knees, the elbows, collarbone, yet the most fundamental violation of modesty of self, we leave it for our children to learn by experience? How is it that just a few years back as a young mother, the only place for me to find substantial information about this issue was in the outside world? It was a book I was given called Stop Child Molestation by Abel and Harlow, and it was my first real step toward healing. It was such a tremendous relief because it was the first time in my life that it was like someone took a huge black hole and just laid it out in front of me simply and honestly. This is what sexual abuse is. This is how to deal with it. If I have to cope with a disease, then I have a right to know everything about it. Then no one has a right to keep that knowledge from me or anyone. It was then that I first became really angry because I realized how much unnecessary suffering we caused for ourselves. The strongest line I had ever heard about this contradiction is by an author of a controversial young adult book who said, adults would never let their children read about the lives they live. It is about time we do. It is our basic responsibility as parents to protect our children for real, by giving them knowledge and words, by being aware of reality and dealing with it the way it is, not the way it should have been. Some of the most devastated people I have met are parents of victims who today, too late, realize what has happened, and there is nothing in the world they would not do to go back and react differently. I don't blame these parents. It is impossible to be a good parent in complete ignorance. And there was a systemized, institutionalized ignorance that left parents in a vacuum, truly not knowing how to react. They found it easier to believe it was their child's imagination than deal with words they did not know could be. I don't know if the ultra-Orthodox world will ever fully come to terms with what has happened. Having met so many victims and the fragments of their lives, I don't know if we will ever fully understand the hell they've created for so many of their own. To do so would entail an honest conversation, about one of our most devastating failures, about ignorance, rabbis, and leaders who chose ideology over reality, a reputation over the lives of children. But for those of us who have survived, who have lived in that underworld and come out alive, we hold sacred knowledge. Words are important. Words are powerful. They give life to an image, reality to an idea. They allow you to go from ignorance to knowledge, to reach from inside your own experience and into another's. But most of all, there is no such thing as bad language, only what is and what isn't. The mind cannot be tainted by a word, only by its refusal to acknowledge it.
Yes, we will, please.